Welcome to this rapid revision session on exam skills, looking at the Pearson Edexcel Paper 3, how useful are sources B and C for inquiry into a stated topic or focus. These are 8-mark questions as part of Paper 3. In the course that I teach, it's a mixture of civil rights and Vietnam, so-called the USA 1954 to 1975 conflict at home and abroad. If you do a different topic though, the general principles within this and the mark schemes will still apply to your particular exam board. And with this specific question, I'll be looking at civil rights. Firstly, an introduction to the Pearson Edexcel Paper 3. These skills might be useful for other exam boards as well, but I'd recommend that you use something specific to your exam board rather than this guide if you really want specific advice on answering questions. The Pearson Edexcel Paper 3 generally covers a modern depth study. An example of such a study, which I teach, is the USA, Conflict at Home and Abroad, 1954 to 1975. This particular topic comprises the civil rights, which is the component known as conflict at home, and the Vietnam War, which means conflict abroad. Other topics are similarly organised, e.g. Germany 1918 to 1939 constitutes both Weimar Germany and Nazi Germany. You'll answer questions on sources, your knowledge and interpretations in this paper. Therefore, there is a separate sources and interpretations sheet and booklet included as part of the exam. You can see that in the instructions on the front page. The total time for this exam is 1 hour or sometimes 1 hour and 25 minutes. You'll find the timings put on the front of the exam paper. That's the time for both sections. It's worth bearing in mind that if you were, for example, doing conflict at home and abroad, it's not necessarily to say that the first section will be on civil rights and the second section will be on the Vietnam War. Actually, it could be the other way round too. Let's have a look at the basic layout of the paper and the instructions that you're given. It's really important to read these because they give you crucial insights as to how you should answer the question, even things as simple as how many questions you should answer and whether you've got any choices. Here's our first instruction. For this section, you'll need to use the sources and interpretations in the sources and interpretations booklet, which you should have been issued with. So make sure you got those to hand. They're included in a separate booklet so you can keep them to hand and keep them in sight while you're writing your answer. Let's have a look at what the question is actually asking of you then. This question is assessing your source analysis skills, which is known as Assessment Objective 3, and should take you about 12 minutes to answer. You'll need to use your own knowledge and provide context. A top tip here though is some of the earlier questions you may have got done a little bit sooner. Any gain time that you have is very useful in terms of annotating and making notes on the sources so that you really understand them. It's crucial here to make sure that you're using the right sources. Typically this paper includes 3 sources and 2 interpretations. Source A goes with the 4-mark question at the start of the paper, and sources B and C are helpful for the rest of the paper. Explain your answer using sources B, C and your own knowledge of the historical context. Make sure you are using the stated sources, which will be, typically like I say, sources B and C. It's an 8-mark answer. That gives an indication as to how much you should write. So that seems clear enough so far. You'll need to ensure that you use the correct sources, sources B and C here, and you'll need to relate utility, which means usefulness, to the inquiry. And the inquiry here is the achievements of the civil rights movement 1960 to 1965. So keep your example strictly within that date range, otherwise they won't be valid. You should prepare by studying and annotating the sources for a few minutes before commencing your answer. Often the first "what can you infer" question is completed in under 6 minutes, which will buy you a bit of extra time. Another thing, these sources will be useful when you deal with the interpretations questions later in the paper. Each source will typically support one or other of the interpretations. Oh, and one further thing, the examiner is never going to give you a useless source. So typically you'll be arguing the extent to which these sources are useful. Some may be more useful than others, but they're never going to be useless. All sources are useful if they're used in the right way. Let's crack on with our annotations of source B then. Remember that what we should be annotating here is things that are useful for an inquiry into the achievements of the civil rights movement in the years 1960 to 65. Here is our source. Source B, a photograph published on the front page of several US newspapers in July 1964. It shows President Johnson presenting Martin Luther King with one of the pens used to sign the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This source has both uses and limitations, and the very best answers will recognise both, while still being very clear as to how useful the source is. I'm going to include my annotations here in full length. Remember, all you need to do for these annotations is write down brief notes that mean something to you. They are for your use, but don't cross them out because they may well be credited by the examiner as well. So don't expect to have to write reams and reams of information like I'm about to show on this screen here. They are only brief annotations or maybe just highlighting things that are useful to you. I always say that it's useful to bear in mind the content of the source first of all. The content of this source is useful because it shows a key moment in civil rights. The passing of the Civil Rights Act was a major event in Lyndon Baines Johnson's presidency and the career of Martin Luther King. I also suggest that you use your own knowledge. What own knowledge do you have here which backs up this source or challenges it? The Civil Rights Act effectively banned segregation in public places, making this an important achievement. So that's useful. But also remember the provenance. This is the background of the source, its origin, its purpose, and who wrote it. This was published on the front page of several papers, which shows that the Civil Rights Act was of national significance. Otherwise, it never would have ended up so prominently on the front pages. So there are plenty of uses of this source, but there are limitations too. Firstly, with regard to the content. The source does not provide details of how this breakthrough was achieved in the years up to 1964. My own knowledge says that the source does not indicate the several weaknesses with this act, e.g. over the voting rights or how widespread support was across the southern states. And also the provenance has some limitations. A photograph can show an important moment, but little else without applying your contextual knowledge, which you would need to do with this source. Alright, now let's do the same for source C. Let's have a look at source C. This is from a radio interview with John Lewis in 2009. Lewis was a civil rights activist who was at the demonstrations in Selma in March 1965, so that looks like it is going to be relevant to our inquiry into the achievements of the civil rights movement in those years. On Sunday the 7th of March, about 600 of us were starting walking in a peaceful fashion through the streets of Selma. As we came to a bridge, the Alabama State Police attacked us and released tear gas. A state trooper hit me on the head with his truncheon. I thought I was going to die. I was knocked out. I really don't know how I made it back across that bridge. President Johnson didn't like what was happening. 8 days later, after Bloody Sunday, he gave one of the most important speeches any president has ever made to Congress when he introduced the Voting Rights Act. 2 weeks later, we marched again. 300 people set off, and by the time we reached Montgomery, there were more than 25,000 people. That march led Congress to pass the Voting Rights Act. Here's some useful content. The source describes the march from Selma, the backlash, and how this might have influenced the president. My own knowledge is relevant too. The Voting Rights Act addressed some of the weaknesses of the Civil Rights Act and its provenance. This was produced by an eyewitness, someone who was there, an eyewitness who would have had good knowledge of the events. The interview is from 2009, so the author has the benefit of hindsight to know what was achieved in 1965 as a result of the Selma March. But there are limitations too. The source does not include details of what led to the protests in Selma. What about my own knowledge? The source is not specific about what the Voting Rights Act actually achieved. And also the provenance. Okay, I'm going to come up with something here. I'm not a big fan of when students say, well, this person is recalling events from many years later, so they've blatantly forgotten what was going on. Think about the most important events in your life. Think about the most important events in anyone's life. Are you really likely to forget them? Bear that in mind. So what I'm going to say about the provenance is that although the author is unlikely to have misremembered or been dishonest about the events of 1965, at least in this case, the source is only the perspective of one civil rights protester. He also may want to emphasise the importance of events with which he was personally involved. Now we've done some annotations, it's time to have a look at the mark scheme quickly to see what's actually required of you. Again, I'm going to ignore level 1 because you really want to be aiming higher than that. How useful are sources B and C for an inquiry into the achievements of the civil rights movement in the years 1960 to 65? All 8 marks here are for AO3, your analysis and evaluation of source utility, or how useful they are. Let's have a look at level 2 first of all. Judgments on source utility for the specified inquiry are given, and it says exactly the same thing in level 3. So where's the distinction? Well, it comes here. Using valid criteria. Judgments are supported by developed comment relating to the content of the sources and or their provenance. Compare that to this. develop reasoning which takes into account how the provenance affects the usefulness of the source content. What that really means is that your use of the provenance, in other words, its background, its purpose, the author, when it was written, etc., actually feeds into your understanding of its usefulness or how useful the actual content is in there. If you were to just deal with the content, your own knowledge and the provenance separately, then you're not quite getting up to level 3. Instead, how does the provenance make you find the content that it gives you actually useful? Also, contextual knowledge is used directly to support the comments, or contextual knowledge is used in the process of interpreting the sources and applying criteria for judgments on their utility. In other words, you're using your knowledge to show why something is useful rather than just adding it in for the sake of it. Let's have a look at some example answers. So this is what it would look like on the exam paper. I often encourage my students to use a process of point, example, explain and link in their writing. This is not absolutely essential, but if you do struggle to structure your paragraphs in a way that's going to be meaningful to the exam criteria, then this is a good way of doing it. Firstly, let's make my point and let's get straight to the point. Source B is useful for an inquiry into the achievements of the civil rights movement in the years 1960 to 65 because it shows the moment one of the main achievements was made. All right, so that's directly answering the question already, saying it is useful. This source shows the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which effectively banned segregation in public places. This is where I'm using my own knowledge to contextualise this. Prior to this, the Greensboro Sit-in and Freedom Rides had worked to achieve integration in specific places, but this law spread to all public places. The fact that this picture was published on several front pages shows that it was a nationally significant event. The fact Johnson is handing Martin Luther King the pen recognises his important role in campaigning for the act. All right, so there I'm looking at both the content but also the provenance here. So considering the provenance, it's on front pages, therefore it's important. This makes it useful for the inquiry as it shows that the campaigns of Martin Luther King were successful in ending segregation in public places. Again, relating it directly back to the inquiry. I'm not saying this is a perfect answer. After all, I'm trying to write as I imagine a very able 16-year-old would write rather than someone with a degree in history like I do. But it's pretty good. So I've made a relevant point about how useful source B is, directly addressing the question. I provided contextual knowledge which helps support that, and I've considered both the provenance and the content in explaining why, and have finally linked it right back to that inquiry, the achievements of the civil rights movement 1960 to 65. Let's consider another approach. However, source B does have limitations, and it's perfectly fine to recognise these. The source does not tell us precisely what the Civil Rights Act achieved, nor does it tell us about its weaknesses. From my own knowledge, I know that there were significant weaknesses in enforcing segregation, equal opportunities, and particularly voting rights. This source may, on its own, exaggerate the impact of the Civil Rights Act as an achievement. This limits its usefulness to the inquiry, as the Civil Rights Act needed to be strengthened in 1965 by the Voting Rights Act. Again, this is relevant knowledge, and it is a relevant explanation of limitations with the source. I'm not saying it's not useful, I'm just saying that its usefulness may be a little bit limited by this. And that's linked again back to the inquiry, the achievements of the Civil Rights Act. In the previous section, I focused on source B. I looked at its uses and then at its limitations. I'm now going to do the same with source C. But bear in mind, another equally valid approach might be to look at the uses of source B and the uses of source C, and then look at the limitations of source B and source C. It really doesn't matter. But now I'm going to look at the usefulness of source C. Source C is also useful because it shows that further campaigning brought about the Voting Rights Act in 1965. I know that civil rights groups continued campaigning after the Civil Rights Act with their demonstrations in Selma, as described in the source. The source describes how the public and violent backlash against the protesters led Johnson to push for a Civil Rights Act, which was a major achievement as it removed many of the barriers Black Americans faced in registering to vote. The source suggests Black Americans saw the demonstrations in Selma as an important part of achieving its aim, as John Lewis, who took part in the demonstrations, is able to explain the reason the Voting Rights Act was achieved with the benefit of hindsight when he was interviewed in 2009. So again, I've been straight to the point here, saying that source C is useful. That's related to the question. I've then given an example of what the protests in Selma actually did. Now, this might have been a good time to include a quote from the source. So why didn't I? Well, quite simply, I was trying to limit the amount of text that was appearing on your screen at one time. But actually, if you were going to include a direct quote from the source, here's where I'd do it. Next, the source describes how the public and violent backlash against protesters led to a push for the Civil Rights Act, is explaining in relation to the question, as does the link at the end. And here I've referred again to the provenance, saying that the information about the importance of the Voting Rights Act is strengthened by the fact that John Lewis is able to look back on things with hindsight and realise how important they were going forward. And now the limitations of Source C. Like last time, however, Source C also has limitations. The source was produced many years after the event and is the perspective of only one campaigner, who may have wanted to emphasise the importance of the demonstrations in Selma as he had taken part. But here actually I start relating it back to its usefulness, and that's fine to do. That said, eyewitness testimony of major events such as this are rarely misremembered, and it remains a valuable individual perspective of how the demonstrations in Selma achieved progress in civil rights. So I've balanced my answer here a bit by recognising a limitation but also saying why it's not that bad. This ultimately makes the source useful. So I get some credit for recognising the limitation, but also for relating it back to the fact that actually, despite this, it's still useful. So I'm still answering that question. How useful is the source? Let's remind ourselves of the question just once more. How useful are sources B and C for an inquiry into the achievements of the civil rights movement? So far we've looked at the sources in isolation. Now let's consider them as a set. This is almost a conclusion. Overall, sources B and C are very useful in showing the achievements of the civil rights movement between 1960 and 1965, but source C is most useful, adding in another layer of analysis there. Both sources provide evidence of two of the most important breakthroughs in legal rights, the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts. However, source C is most useful because it also provides evidence from an eyewitness as to how this progress was often achieved through protests and enduring a violent backlash. Together, the sources are useful for showing some of the tactics used to bring progress and in giving examples of what civil rights movements achieved. So there we go, linking it back to the question and considering the usefulness of these sources together. So I get some credit for that because that's directly linked to the question. I've supported it with some of my own knowledge and how this was done and linked it back again. So overall, I covered both sources, usefulness, their limitations, and given an overall judgment. It should be 8 marks. But what if I'd made a complete pig's ear of this? Well, let's consider an answer which is less good. Try not to do this. Civil rights groups achieved the signing of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 as shown in Source B. This law effectively ended segregation in public spaces, established an Equal Opportunities Commission and provided some regulations for voting registration. However, it also had weaknesses, as many serious gaps in the law existed, allowing states to still discriminate against black voters. This source shows an important moment still. Well, I get some credit for recognising that actually it does give some valuable information in Source B, but the rest, well, I'm afraid it's not that effective, simply because it is not actually addressing the question. At no point in the rest of the answer do I explicitly say how this information makes it useful. It's just description of facts. It's just stating things that are so. It is not directly answering the question. And here, you're not just meant to be giving your knowledge of this particular topic, you're meant to be using the sources and relating them to their usefulness. So make sure that you focus on the question and you don't make a mistake like this. Nothing here is inaccurate, but it's not addressing the question. Something to bear in mind as well is that later in the paper you'll have 2 interpretations. You don't deal with this in quite the same way, and I've got a separate rapid revision video looking at the interpretations questions within paper 3, which actually looks at a Vietnam War example. But let's consider the interpretations that went with these sources in the real 2019 exam. Firstly, interpretation 1, and then interpretation 2. You might want to pause the video here, read these interpretations for yourself, and decide which of these particular interpretations goes with each source. In other words, which source backs up the information in the interpretations. Pause now if you want to, if not, I'll give you the answer. So interpretation 1 backs up source B, or rather source B supports this interpretation, suggesting that the Civil Rights Act is actually the really big deal here. This is because it emphasises the importance of the Civil Rights Act of 64, which is the subject of source B. That means by a process of elimination, and because we've checked, interpretation 2 is supported by source C. Here's why. This is because it emphasises the importance of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which is related to the Selma March in source C. So remember this, when it comes to the interpretations questions, you are absolutely allowed to use the sources. Some final points then. How useful questions require some careful thought. You simply need to explain the usefulness of both sources in relation to the stated inquiry, and you've got to keep that in mind. When annotating your sources and dealing with them, consider the content. What information do they give you, and is that relevant and is that useful? Your own knowledge. Does this challenge what is said in the source, or does it back it up? And the provenance. How does its origin, its use, its purpose, its author, and when it was created affect both the uses and limitations of the sources you're studying? Remember to come to an overall judgment. How useful are the sources? That's what you're being asked. You should spend about 12 minutes on this question. A few minutes reading and labelling and annotating the sources is time well spent, and probably time that you've saved from some of the earlier questions earlier on. But remember, this question could be on either part of your studies. So if, like my students, you're doing USA conflict at home and abroad, it could be either on civil rights or Vietnam. One thing though, once you've seen the topic of the sources, that clues you in as to what the rest of the exam paper is going to be on. So if the sources are on a particular part of civil rights, then the interpretations and the following interpretations questions are going to stick to that topic, because it's a necessary truth that one has to follow the other. I hope that's been useful. After all, it's been one of my longer so-called rapid revision videos, but I really wanted to go into detail as to how you address these questions. I hope it has been useful. If it has, like this video and subscribe to the channel. And you could always pop a comment in the suggestions below and actually ask me further questions if you want anything cleared up. If you're not doing the USA conflict at home and abroad questions, then remember the mark schemes are still the same, and I would recommend that you look up some past papers and have a go at some sources for your own. But other than that, I'll say thanks for watching and goodbye. Oh, and if you've got an exam coming up, the best of luck too.